When I was a kid, my parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles were a lot different than parents seem to be today. We would just be sent outside to play at even really young ages without any supervision at all. This happened all the time, especially when we would be visiting my grandma's house. She lived out in the country too, so we were used to going out and playing hide and seek or doing whatever in the woods. When I was like 9 years old, I think, my grandma actually began seeing a guy who lived even further out into the country than she did. He didn't even have a working bathroom in his house. Instead, there was an outhouse outside. I always remember him claiming all the way until the day he died that he had never once used an inside toilet his entire life. The house he lived in, up in the middle of nowhere, was this really small shack. We were only there to visit, and at night we would go back to my grandma's actual house in order to sleep, while she and he stayed there. The reason I bring this up is because of just how rural it was. It was literally one of those cabins in the woods you would see from horror-type movies. This event happened my very first time out visiting there. While I was used to the woods that surrounded my grandma's house, I was not at all familiar with this particular area. As normal, my family always felt that the kids should go outside and play, so they sent us out on our own. 3 of my cousins and I went out to explore this new area. We had gotten pretty far away from the house when we decided to go and play some hide and seek. When I was off to hide, I found myself a very good hiding spot, behind a rock that was jutting out from the side of a hill. It was a pretty ingenious spot, and I knew no one would ever be able to find me. Well, I was right. I was under that rock for a very long time, just waiting and waiting for someone to show up, but no one did. After waiting and waiting even longer, I finally decided to climb out from under the rock and see just what was going on. I couldn't find any of my cousins. I kept walking around, calling out for them. However, I didn't get an answer from a single one of them. I didn't begin panicking yet though, even though I was starting to get a little bit scared. I figured if I couldn't find them, I would just head back to my grandma's boyfriend's shack. And yes, if you're wondering, saying grandma's boyfriend does sure sound weird as heck. I began heading back to the shack, or at least I thought that I was heading back there. I don't know how long it had taken us to get to the area we were playing hide and seek in, but after a while, I realized it was taking me a lot longer than that to get back. It had been late afternoon when we headed out, and it was in the fall, so it was beginning to get dark outside too. That finally got me starting to panic a little bit. I kept trying to find my way back, but the more and more I did, I just kept getting myself more and more lost. The fact the sun was now setting was scaring me even more. It wasn't very long at all until it was completely dark outside, and I was super duper lost. If you've never been out in the woods in the dark, it's hard to imagine just how scary it really is. At 9 years old, it was the most terrifying thing in the world. Every little noise was scary, trying to figure out what it could be. A child's imagination is so much more vivid than an adult's, and it comes up with the worst ideas it can as well. If I knew then what I know now, I would have stopped just wandering around in the dark. I was just getting myself more and more lost. I kept hoping to hear my parents' voices calling out for me or something. I kept on telling myself if I just kept walking, I would eventually make it back to the shack. Wandering in the dark, I was extremely hungry and thirsty now. I was only finally able to get some water to drink when I stumbled across a creek. I was used to drinking from creeks like this, so I drank up quite a bit. I also had not come across a creek before on the way there, so I knew I must be much more lost than I initially thought I was. Not knowing what else to do, I began to follow this creek. I figured it must lead somewhere, which in retrospect doesn't really make too much sense, but I didn't know what else to do. After a while though, I thought I saw something up ahead of me. Although it was dark out, the moon was pretty full, so I did have at least some light. That also made it easier to see up ahead. There was something sitting by the creek ahead of me. As I got closer, I began to notice it seemed to be a person, a really raggy person. wearing a coat or perhaps something with a long hood. I considered walking up to this person and asking him if he could help me find my way back to my grandma's boyfriend's house, but he was also a stranger, and I was taught I was not supposed to talk to them. While I was wondering just what to do, he stood up suddenly. He must have noticed me behind him because he began walking in my direction. More so, it seemed like he was limping as he was coming as well. I didn't know how to react to this situation. I just kinda stood there in fear. He came closer and closer to me, and I got my first good look at him. He had his hood on, but he had a lot of really long, ratty and matted hair as well. His skin was very white, and I could see various cracks in it as he got closer to me. About 10 feet away, I finally heard him talk. "Little boys shouldn't be out in these woods so late at night, you know. You never know what might get ya." It was terrifying. My body took over and I took off, running back into the woods away from the creek. The man was pretty decrepit, so it was easy enough to outrun him. I didn't even look behind me to see if he was trying to catch me. I just ran and ran. I did lose the guy in the end, but now I was even more lost myself. I was scared even more with every little noise that I heard. At the very least, I was headed in the opposite direction of the creek, which had to be leading me back to the shack surely. I'll cut to the chase though. After an hour or so of retreating away from this creek, I noticed some lights up ahead. I also heard someone calling out my name. It was my dad, and he was out searching for me with my grandma's boyfriend. I ran up to them basically crying my eyes out. I was just happy to be found. To this day, I've never had a scarier experience. I told everyone about what I had seen. My grandma's boyfriend told me he thought he might knew the guy that I described to him. Apparently, he was an old guy who lived even further into the woods than this guy did. There were a lot of stories about him doing some pretty horrible and illegal things. He'd even been suspected of abducting a kid about 30 years prior. He was never charged with anything though because the kid was never found. That's the time when he moved out into the middle of nowhere. Very few people ever see him or have any contact with him. I do find it weird that they would have told me these things at 9 years old, but I guess this was a different time and they were different people. But yeah, that old man was my boogeyman for a whole lot of years. I truly do not know how to explain what happened here. I can only tell you what occurred. I have problems sleeping very often, and I tend to wake up immediately as the sun comes up. Although I have blinds on my windows, I think everyone knows they mostly do very little to keep the room from getting very bright. So, in order to be able to sleep in if I need to, I sleep in a canopy bed. For those of you who might not know what that is, it's basically a bed frame with curtains on it. I pull the curtains, which on my bed are pretty heavy, so when the sun comes up, it remains relatively dark on the bed. I always sleep with those curtains drawn without exception. This just happened to me a few days ago. I was alone in bed, mostly because I live alone anyway. This was one of those nights where I was having a hard time falling asleep. I was just lying there, trying to get my mind to think of something light or funny, because that's generally what I do to go to sleep. I don't know exactly how long I was lying in bed. I sleep on my side, too. From behind me, I could hear a whispering, almost a hissing type voice saying, "Get up! Get up! Get up!" A shock went through my body, and I sat straight up in bed. I turned to the direction that the voice had come from, but of course, with the curtains on the bed closed, I was not able to see anything at all. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I had very clearly heard someone in my room, and whoever it was sounded crazy. I had no way to tell where the person who had whispered at me could have been in my room. I don't know how long I sat there in the bed, waiting to see if I would hear another noise or something. If someone was moving around in my bedroom, it should have been quiet enough for me to hear it, but I couldn't hear anything. I was too scared to open the curtain and look around, because again, I didn't want to know what I would find. My bed was up against the wall. I scrunched back up against it, as I listened to see if whoever was in my room would say anything else, but no matter how much time passed, I did not hear a single thing. Finally, I decided I needed to go look around my house to see if anyone was actually there. I had an old baseball bat in my room, so I picked that up and started searching through my home. I didn't find anyone in the house though. I did notice that my basement door to the outside was unlocked. I promptly locked it and checked all of the windows in the house to make sure they were locked as well. I have no real idea if anyone was actually there. I have no idea who or what was whispering at me, but I do know that that experience only made it even more difficult for me to go to sleep. It's been several days since then, and I've not had an experience like this since. When I was 16, I was allowed to drive around the extra car, and of course, I spent this time driving around with my friends as much as possible. I was also allowed to stay out a lot later than normal, and was given a bunch of other freedoms around that time as well. I was driving home on a Friday night once. It was pretty late, and when I got to the house, it was pretty dark. I was an only child. My parents hadn't told me where they were going that night, but they were obviously not home when I arrived. I hit the button to open up the garage and pulled into it. As I did though, I noticed some movement in the corner of the garage. After my eyes started to adjust, I noticed that there was someone in the garage, hiding in the corner. Someone had broken into our house and was hiding in the garage. That was the only explanation. The door was halfway down at this point. I hit the button to have it open back up. I was terrified and waited for it to be high enough for me to pull out of the garage. When it was, I pulled out as fast as I could and rushed down the street. I knew where the police station was, so I drove directly there. They drove out to the house while I waited there at the station. The guy was of course not at the house still, but they did pick him up in the end. He had some items on him he'd stolen from our house. He had also been in jail before for assault, I found out. I couldn't help but thinking after what might have happened if I hadn't noticed that man hiding in the garage. What would have happened if I had just gotten out of the car with the intruder lurking there in the dark behind me? I have no idea, but I'm sure I was very lucky that I did notice him. During college, I dated a fairly well-known and talented local musician named Tim. As horrible boyfriends tend to be in the beginning, he was loving, attentive, charismatic, and seemingly a very normal partner. He made me personal mixtapes, cooked me my favorite meals, and even dedicated songs to me at open mics around town. I, young, foolish, and naive, was deeply smitten by his mysterious, dark, and artistic allure. However, over the course of our year-long relationship, his mental health severely declined. He had the ability to appear lucid and normal around other people, but in private he began suffering severe delusions. He would compulsively lie and started creating art that focused heavily on themes of rape and murder. I was worried sick, and his condition was exhausting, but I did my very best to be kind, understanding, and supportive. I loved him and believed he shouldn't have to struggle with this mental illness alone. One time, he vanished without a trace for an entire day. I found his apartment empty, lights on, front door wide open, phone still on his nightstand. I took a few deep breaths and called all around the city for hours before finally discovering he had involuntarily been checked into a mental hospital. I did my best to be strong for him, seeing him every day during supervised visitation hour, bringing him his favorite books to pass the time and holding him as he sobbed that it was all a mistake, that he did not belong there. It was surreal to see my gentle, intelligent, and normal, albeit somewhat depressed boyfriend, surrounded by visibly insane long-term psych ward patients. I mean, for real, the place was like something out of a horror movie. In retrospect, none of the staff ever told me the real reason why he was there, and I was too polite and naive to ask. Our relationship ended a few months later. I found undeniable evidence he was cheating on me, and secretly relieved I confronted him. I told him to leave my apartment and never come back. He cracked in that moment. The gentle Tim I had known and loved melted away to reveal a new persona, one with dead, wild animal eyes. He threatened to kill himself with pills unless I took him back, but I was so extremely done that I just called the police instead. They weren't much help, of course, but Tim did leave after that. I blocked him everywhere and never contacted him again. He would leave me insane voicemails, though, from different numbers every time, for weeks and weeks afterwards. I was relatively unshaken, though, and things eventually returned to normalcy. I graduated and got a sweet job in the same cool college city. 6 months later, I woke up to concerned texts from mutual friends saying they didn't want to freak me out, but Tim was off his meds now. He was clearly manic and posting a newly written song all over social media. His best friend, who hadn't been in touch since before the breakup, sent me an apology along with a screenshot of the lyrics. That got my attention. I won't copy and paste them here because they'll lead back to his Bandcamp, but I knew immediately the song was pretty explicitly about my rape and murder, but in a clever, disguised way. A catchy way too, apparently, the bastard. I checked his profiles myself from a friend's account. He was posting dozens and dozens of totally insane rambling statuses, most of them all about me. They flip-flopped between flowery love prose and murder imagery. His friends were reacting with concern, but a few egged him on, probably thinking he was just venting about his ex. I decided it would be best to continue ignoring him, but I saved screenshots just in case. A few days later, while at work, I looked up from my computer to see Tim enter into the far side of the studio. My blood turned to ice. He was talking to my creative director. It looked cordial enough from first glance, until I saw Tim begin to casually scan the studio searching for me. I ducked down and bolted into my favorite project manager's office. I slammed the door and unleashed upon her what must have been a nearly unintelligible explanation of what was happening. I was shaking so hard I could barely even speak. Nancy, though, for her part, was amazing. She understood everything almost immediately. She snuck me out of the building and drove me in her car to the police station, where I showed officers the screenshots and filed a report. My coworkers later told me Tim was there to inquire about the open designer position. Well, he was not a designer. He had brought with him a fake portfolio and an elaborately fabricated work history that sounded completely legit. At the end of his interview, he'd even casually asked if I still worked there. He said we used to collaborate. Oh, and he had written a song just for me. It had been picked up by the local radio this morning. He asked my coworkers to let me know with warmest regards. That phrase still makes my skin crawl. He then left, found my abandoned car in the parking lot, and paced around it in circles until the police arrived. Unfortunately, he was not enough of a public menace for police to bring him in that day, but the incident did help me to secure a restraining order against him. My company was amazing too, luckily. I was deeply embarrassed about my literally insane ex coming to the studio. The CEO filed trespassing charges against him and created an action plan to keep me safe if it happened again. Not long afterwards, though, I moved to a different city, and that was that. I haven't heard from him since. I discovered the most alarming part later, though. His roommate at the time, Liz, went through a similar experience with him during his breakdown. When we compared notes much later, she said she had seen a large axe in Tim's car the very same week it had all gone down. She was worried about Tim's Facebook activity, so she removed the axe and hid it while he didn't know. Tim was so angry when he found out, he completely trashed their entire house and never came back. If all our timelines are correct, that must have been just before he came into my workplace for his interview. So this story might not really be as spectacular as some of the other ones you've heard, though it was disturbing enough that I remember the event in vivid detail. It is somewhat long, but I'll try to condense it to the point it doesn't bore anyone or anything. The cast is myself, my sister S, and the older dude Carl. It's not his real name, but it will be used for the sake of this story. This happened when I was around the age of 14 to 15. I had gone to a theme park, Great America I think, when my older sister was around the age of 17 or 18. S pestered me to go onto a ride with her that I was not comfortable riding at the time. Finally, after a bunch of bugging though, I budged and said I'd go with her. While we stood in line, S and I heard Carl yelling about his favorite sports teams to seemingly nobody. He was with a group of girls, so we assumed he was just having a good time with his friends, but apparently that was not the case. Anyway, S and I got on the ride from start to finish. The ride itself was like a pirate ship that basically swung back and forth similar to a pendulum, and eventually started to do complete circles, causing passengers to temporarily hang upside down. The ride itself is not really key to the story, beside the fact that it made me extremely nauseous afterwards. After the ride had finished, I noticed that the girls that were previously with Carl had left him while screaming that he was a weirdo. I didn't really pay that much attention to them. My stomach was seriously acting up. I guess I should have though. At the time, S and I were standing on top of a bridge, and I told S I needed a minute to recompose myself. I walked over to the railing of the bridge and leaned over to breathe some fresh air while trying my best not to puke. Basic breathing stuff, really. This is where the story gets weird. While I'm leaning over this railing, I suddenly feel these huge arms wrap around my waist, and then I'm hoisted up into the air. Initially, I'm freaking out, trying to comprehend what the hell is actually happening to me in that moment. All I really knew is that now I was in the air, and I was not exactly sure why. I thought whoever was holding me up was going to throw me over the bridge, but instead they put me down on the ground after a moment. I instantly whipped around, only to see Carl there smiling at me. S ran over to stand beside me, and asked Carl why he just yanked me up into the air. I was still in a state of shock at the time and couldn't speak. The following conversation ensued. "Why the hell did you pick him up?" "Oh, well, he looked sick and like he might need some fresh air." "Tell me how exactly lifting someone into the air is going to help with a sickness." Carl ignored the question and stared at me, asking me how I was doing. I ignored him in turn and looked away from him, since my sister was now doing all the talking. "Come on, kid. Look at someone when they speak to you. You bored or something? I bet you're bored going on rides with your sister, friend, sibling. Doesn't matter. I heard her screaming her lungs out on that ride we all just went on. I bet she doesn't want to go on any of the more scary ones. Yeah, she's no fun. You'll probably have to go home soon because of her." Note, my sister had been screaming a lot on the ride. She told me she screams on rides because it raises her adrenaline levels, causing her to have more fun or something. "Leave him alone. What we're doing is none of your business." "Oh, but it is. I want everyone that comes to this park to have a great time. I mean, it's Great America after all. Tell you what, kid, how about you and I go to the water park and ditch your little friend here? She's not gonna have much fun getting wet anyway, but trust me, we will. We can both go on all the water rides that you want, and afterwards I can take you out and grab some lunch maybe." I don't know what you all think about an old random man asking a 14 to 15-year-old to go out with him, but I instantly thought this dude was trying to kidnap me. I felt this guy was a danger to myself and possibly S as well, so I made a movement to walk away from him. Carl subtly stepped in front of me to block my path of exit, so I had to think of another way we could get past him. I feigned getting a phone call from my parents. "Hi, Mom? Oh yeah, my sister and I were just getting off the pirate ship ride." "Wait, you're waiting right outside the ride near the food court? Okay, my sister and I will meet you there right now then. See you soon." I said it in a loud enough voice that Carl could hear everything that transpired, and with newly found confidence I pushed right past him. S and I walked away from Carl in the direction that my feigned mother was apparently waiting. After we walked for about 10 to 15 seconds, we both broke out into a sprint until we reached the park entrance. We tried to tell the front desk people about the guy, but they said since nothing actually happened, they couldn't really do anything. So, a little bit of background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired, and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money between his retirement and what Mom was making as a bookkeeper/tax prep, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care much if I came there and helped him out with stocking the coolers or even running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This all took place in the late 80s and early 90s. The actual story I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday. Being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit. My dad would let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both at day and at night. I was sitting in my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows, book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register and stock the cooler at different times. I remember at one point glancing up because something had caught my attention that was unusual. I realized a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. This in and of itself was really strange. Where we're located, you don't exactly get many people walking, and definitely not coming from the direction of that interstate. I figured she must have broken down somewhere and was coming to use the phone for a tow truck call or something. I was completely wrong. She came into the store and looked around for a few minutes. I remember immediately getting a strange and creepy feeling from her. She walked right up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she'd gotten stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town up north from us. Ocala was the town. This is important. My dad let her know that he was working and there was no way he could take her at the moment. Instead, she turned and looked at me. While she was looking away from him, my dad caught my eye and suddenly shook his head no. I was confused for a second. Then she turned back to my dad and pointed at me, asking if I could take her instead. My dad responded back I had only just gotten my learner's permit. I wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Now normally I would have done it even though it was illegal, because I'd done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad though, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally very chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason he was extremely dismissive and almost curt with this one. Turns out he'd gotten a bad vibe about her from the minute he'd seen her walking up the drive. Well, she cussed at him for a minute, and he basically told her to get the fuck out the store. She slammed the door open. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she slammed it. She then walked out of the store and down the driveway. I kept a close eye on her and watched as she made her way back up to the interstate, then walked up the northbound on-ramp. Almost a year passed by, and I'm in my bedroom less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad suddenly yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here and look at this." I quickly ran into the living room and saw my dad pointing at the TV. I looked at the mugshot of the lady up on the screen and immediately recognized the lady who had been in the store that night. Turns out I'd almost given a car ride to Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and later put to death. Still gives me nightmares about what could have happened.